From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the District of Literature. This is a wonderful event, and we are delighted at the Writers Center to be part of this event. I'm Stuart Moss. I'm the Executive Director of the Writers Center, located in Bethesda. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a literary community. We do about 300 workshops a year in all kinds of writing, all genres of writing, and we have a series of events as well. And we are thrilled to be here. If you remember after this, please pick up a copy of our current workshop and event guide that not only has a whole listing of our workshops through early December, but also has a listing of all of our events, most of which are free and open to the public. It's my great pleasure to introduce our three authors. And what I'm going to do is to introduce all of them first, and then they'll come up one by one to give their readings. And I'll introduce them in alphabetical order as well. A.X. Ahmad grew up in India, was educated at MIT, and worked for many years as an international architect before taking up writing full-time. His short stories and essays on immigrant life have been published in many literary magazines and been listed in Best American Essays. He studied writing at NYU, the New School, and Grub Street. A.X. lives in Washington, D.C., teaches at the Bethesda Writers Center. The Caretaker is the first in a trilogy featuring the adventures of illegal immigrant Ranjit Singh. The Last Taxi Ride, the second in the series, will be published in June of 2014. Elliot Holt, sitting next to A.X., was born and raised in Washington, D.C., a former copywriter who worked at advertising agencies in Moscow, London, and New York. Holt attended the MFA program at Brooklyn College, where she won the Hyman Brown Award at night while working full-time in Manhattan during the day. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Guernica, Kenyon Review Online, Bellevue Literary Review, the Pushcart Prize 35, that's the 2011 anthology, and elsewhere. In addition to winning a Pushcart Prize, she was the runner-up of the 2011 Penn Emerging Writers Award. Her first novel, You Are One of Them, was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. And finally, Richard McCann is the author of Mother of Sorrows, which is a collection of linked stories in the poetry collection Ghost Letters, winner of the 1994 Beatrice Holly Award and the 1994 Capricorn Poetry Award. He is also the editor with Michael Klein of Things Shaped in Passing, More Poets for Life, writing from the AIDS pandemic. His work has appeared in magazines such as The Atlantic, Esquire, Ms., and Tin House, and in several anthologies, including the O. Henry Prize Stories, 2007, and Best American Essays, 2000. He has received awards and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, the MacDowell Colony, and Yaddo. He teaches at American University and was named the 2005 AU Scholar Teacher of the Year. So it's my great pleasure to bring up first A.X. Ahmad. And please, could you turn off your cell phones, as I'm about to do as well.
Wow, I've never had to go through security to come to a reading before. I mean, as a Muslim guy with a beard, I'm used to getting pulled over in airports, but Today I thought of making a joke. They said, do you have any incendiary objects? And I was going to say, oh yeah, just my writing, but I wanted to be here, so I didn't make that joke. But seriously, it's a great honor to be here and to be reading with Elliot and Richard. And thank you, Stuart and Sunil and everybody at the Writers Center for putting this together. This is, for an immigrant kid like me, to be reading at the Library of Congress is amazing. It's just unthinkable. I'm going to read 3 short scenes from my novel, The Caretaker, to give you a sense of the emotional arc of the book. And I'll start with the prologue, which is pretty self-explanatory. At 19,000 feet on the Siachen Glacier, there's no longer earth and sky, just an endless mountain of snow. In this infinity of white are 6 men walking in a line, moving in the drunken lockstep of the exhausted. They wear white snowsuits over their Indian Army uniforms. Heavy assault rifles are slung across their backs. Their lips are split and bleeding, their eyes hidden by snow goggles. It is quiet up here. The only sound is their ragged breathing. The soldier at the end of the line is a gangly 19-year-old. He hums tunelessly, then begins to sing, his voice growing louder. Loaded like a freight train, flying like an aeroplane. The turbaned seat captain at the front of the line turns angrily. Shut up, Private Dewan. Loaded like a freight train. The reedy voice rises to a shout. Flying like an aeroplane. For God's sake, somebody shut him up. The soldier in front of Private Dewan raises his rifle like a club, is about to bring it down when the sergeant intervenes. Let me handle this. He's just a boy. Sergeant Khandelkar grips the private by his thin shoulders and whispers urgently. The singing stops, and once again there's only the deep silence of the mountains. Captain Singh calls for a halt. The men drop their packs and slump into the snow. Sergeant Khandelkar's bony face is dark with worry, and he speaks in a low voice. Captain, any idea where we are? Have we crossed over into Pakistani territory? The captain shrugs. They'd left the Indian Army base camp far down the glacier 2 days ago. Maps are useless up here. Technically, India and Pakistan are not at war, but the Siachen Glacier is a gray zone between the 2 countries, a place of armed skirmishes and ambushes. They've been on tough missions up here, but this one is different. Complete radio silence, no helicopter evacuations, no parachute drops of ammunition. Like ghosts, they are to cross high up into Pakistani territory, hit their target, and come back undetected. The captain glances at Private Dewan. The boy is staring up into the sun with unseeing eyes. Sergeant Khandelkar leans in. Sir, I'm worried about him. It looks like high-altitude cerebral edema. His brain is swelling. He'll be hallucinating soon. They both look at Private Dewan, who is now giggling to himself. He does a little twirl in the snow, then starts humming again. The captain's face darkens. If he compromises the mission, we're going to have to leave him behind. No! Sergeant Khandelkar's voice rises to a shout, and he makes an effort to lower it. He's just a kid. We can't do that. I'll walk with him, sir. I'll keep him quiet. All right, but keep a close watch on him. If he's any trouble at all. The corners of the sergeant's mouth turn down in disgust. This mission stinks, sir. We've been walking 3 days to reach a set of coordinates. Why couldn't they tell us what our target is? Captain Singh shrugs. This is how it's done these days, Sergeant. They dream up these missions down in New Delhi, and we do the dirty work. The sergeant sniffs indignantly but keeps his peace. Private Dewan is smiling blankly now. He begins to hum again the same stupid tune from some stupid American band. Time to move on, Sergeant. Gather the men. And keep an eye on that boy. The soldiers rise slowly, pull on their heavy packs, and start walking. Captain Singh thinks he hears a noise and looks sharply up the mountain. There is nothing to see but snow. So the protagonist of my book is a Sikh Indian Army captain whose name is Ranjit Singh. Something goes terribly wrong on that mission on the Siachen Glacier, and Ranjit has to leave India in disgrace. He ends up coming to America with his wife and young daughter, and when the book opens, Ranjit has spent the summer doing landscaping work on the island of Martha's Vineyard. But now it's the fall, and Ranjit desperately needs a new job that will allow him to survive the winter on that island. In this scene, Ranjit has just picked up his 9-year-old daughter Shanti from school and is heading to meet a rich African-American senator. Ranjit hopes that he will get a job as a caretaker looking after the senator's house. Ranjit drives across the island toward the senator's house, his daughter Shanti sitting beside him. Martha's Vineyard is small, roughly triangular, 20 miles from east to west and 10 from north to south, but it houses many worlds. The Wasps live behind their white picket fences in Edgartown, while Oak Bluffs is the home of the African-American elite. Senator Niels has chosen to live far away, among the movie stars and tycoons of Aquinnah, his custom-designed house perched high on its red clay cliffs. Papa Ji, are you listening to me? Ranjit looks down at his daughter, realizing she's been talking all this time. Sorry, Beti, what were you saying? You need to listen. This girl in my grade, she said that all Indians are short. I said, no way, you should see my dad. And she said, you just look tall because you wear a turban. And I said, my dad is tall, even without a turban. But she wouldn't believe me. Can you believe it? Beti, Americans have strange ideas about us. Not all of them, just some. And oh, Miss Heather said to ask you if we're staying for the winter. She said that all the foreign kids start school in the fall, but then they leave and she never gets the textbooks back. Are we going back to Boston? Ranjit thinks of his 2 miserable years in Boston, frying samosas in the basement of Lallu's Indian store. We're staying, Beti. Tell your teacher we're not going anywhere. Okay, good. I like it here. Hey, I know the capitals of all 50 states. Let's play, okay? Easy one first. What's the capital of New York? New York City, obviously. No, silly, it's Albany. Now, California? San Francisco? Shanti peels with laughter. It's Sacramento. Everybody knows that. It makes no sense. Here they always choose someplace that no one has heard of. In India, the biggest city is the capital, like Mumbai or Chennai. Papa Ji, really, Shanti says, dissolving with laughter. And he smiles too. Being with her always makes him feel better. As they enter the town of Oak Bluffs, Ranjit smells hot cheese from a pizza parlor and feels a sudden pang of hunger. Then remembers that he has no money left. He turns to his daughter. Shanti, we need to make one stop before we go home. I have to talk to Senator Niels for a few minutes. Is he the man who's been on television all the time? Yes, that man. But don't ask him any questions. Why? Beti, rich people don't like that. If he asks you any questions, just answer politely. I'm always polite, Papaji. You know that. Ranjit nods, but he is surprised at how much information Shanti soaks up. Pritham always has the television on, and Senator Niels has been on the news for the last 2 nights. The news station replayed the same footage over and over, showing the senator walking briskly up the steps of the floodlit Capitol in Washington. Despite his 60-plus years of age, he had the quick grace of a much younger man, and his dark blue suit only emphasized his barrel chest and wide shoulders. Reaching the top of the Capitol stairs, the senator made a speech about freedom and democracy, and then handed over the microphone to a young Korean-American woman journalist. Still pale from her months in North Korean captivity, the woman described in a shaking voice her arrest on a trumped-up charge of spying and a subsequent death sentence. If the senator hadn't flown to Pyongyang to negotiate on her behalf, her body would now be arriving home in a plywood box. The news stations all called the senator a hero, and there was even talk of him running for president. Earlier that summer, the same news stations had predicted that the senator wouldn't be reelected. Thinking about it, Ranjit shakes his head. Opinions change so fast in this country. As they drive on, the twilight gathers around them, and Ranjit flicks on his headlights, illuminating stone boundary walls. Hidden behind these are the summer estates of the millionaires, only their driveways and no trespassing signs visible from the road. The houses are set far back, facing the water. They're empty now, inhabited only by mice and the blinking lights of alarm systems. If this were India, poor people would cut the power to the alarms and move in, shit in the jacuzzis, keep goats and chickens in the empty swimming pools. But this is not India, this is the vineyard, and all these beautiful, perfect houses lie empty for most of the year. They drive through the exclusive towns of West Tisbury and Chilmark, and soon they are at the edge of the island, the jagged cliffs falling away to the ocean below. Ranjit turns into a gravel driveway that curves down the hillside, and the truck winds around the sharp turns. After one last dizzying twist, the road flattens out, and there, beyond the senator's house, is the ink-black ocean, ranks of white-capped waves racing to the open horizon. He turns off the engine, and the air is filled with the sound of water. Shanti sits silently, mesmerized by the view. "Beti," he says, "do you know what ocean that is?" "The Atlantic Ocean." "And what's on the other side?" "India." "How come India, not Europe?" Shanti shakes her head firmly. "No, it's India. That's what Mama says." "What do you remember about India, Beti?" She takes a deep breath. "We were rich in India, and we had a big house and mango trees and many servants." Ranjit nods slowly. Just as he thought, she doesn't remember a damn thing about India, and now Preetham is filling her head with nonsense. "Wait in the truck. I have to talk to the senator." Crunching over the gravel, he approaches the house, praying under his breath. "Please, Guru, please let me get this job." From this level, the house looks deceptively like a modest one-story. The rest of it is hidden on the other side, 2 lower floors of steel and glass cut into the hillside, ending in a terraced garden with a kidney-shaped swimming pool. The doorbell chimes deep within the house, but there are no answering footsteps. Despite the chill, perhaps Senator Niels is out on the rear deck, where the sound of the doorbell will be drowned out by the waves. Ranjit walks toward the high hedges that shield the back of the house. He spent hours during the summer trimming them into perfect cubes, but scraggly branches have broken through, undoing all his hard work. Pushing through a gap in the hedges, Ranjit looks at the rear of the house, its rows of tall windows dark and silent. He takes one step forward and almost falls over Senator Niels. So the final scene is very short from the middle of the book. Things have gone terribly wrong, and Ranjit is now alone and on the run, being pursued by 2 armed men. Ranjit realizes that it's too dangerous for him to continue wearing his turban and full beard because he'll be easily spotted. In this scene, he's hiding out in a Fleabag Hotel in Boston's Chinatown. The fluorescent light in the tiny bathroom buzzes and blinks into life. Touching the back of his head, Ranjit feels his hair matted with blood. At least his scalp has stopped bleeding. Taking off his shirt, he stands bare-chested in front of the small mirror. The glass has lost most of its silvering over the years, but the murky image that stares back at him is unmistakably that of a bearded Sikh. He unknots his hair and it falls to his waist. There are glimmers of gray in his beard that weren't there a few days ago. It does not matter now. He remembers walking through the golden temple with his mother. Mataji had pointed at the men bathing in the glittering waters of the Sarovar, the sacred lake. "Ranjit," she had said, "a Sikh never cuts his hair. Our ancestors were warriors who would rather face death than be defiled. Your turban is part of who you are. If you lose your identity, you lose yourself. You must never betray the Gurus." He had looked at his reflection in the water, proud of his turban, proud to be a Sikh, and he had promised her that he would never betray his faith. He can hear his mother praying, her voice melodious and strong. "Even in a gale of torrential rain, I would go to meet my Guru. Even if an ocean separates them, a Sikh would go to meet his Guru. As a man dies of thirst without water, a Sikh would die without his Guru." Now, standing in the gloomy bathroom, he opens his eyes and looks at himself one last time. Taking a deep breath, he raises the gleaming scissors to his head. "Forgive me, Mataji." His arm aches and the bathroom floor is inches deep in thick black hair. When he's done with his scalp, he begins cutting into his beard and mustache, and soon there's only stubble. He soaps his face and shaves using the cheap plastic razor. He's clumsy and cuts himself, and the white lather on his face turns pink. When he's done, he runs a plastic comb through his hair, feeling the teeth bite into his scalp. Maybe he shouldn't have cut his hair quite so short. Now he'll have to buy some gel and spike it like he's seen in the magazines. He gathers up the drifts of hair from the floor and stuffs them into a plastic bag, all the while avoiding his reflection in the mirror. When he can delay no more, he is forced to look at himself. A stranger's face stares back from the mirror, short, spiky hair, a long face with a strong jaw, a sharp nose, and tired eyes. And there is a scar, a thick ridge that starts under his jaw and curves to his left ear. With his beard gone, it is exposed. He turns his head away, shuts off the bathroom lights, and heads to the trash chute down the corridor. Pulling open the metal flap, he throws the bag down its dark mouth, imagining his black ropes of hair mingled with chicken bones and bloody paper towels. A part of himself will now remain forever in America. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? No. Yes? No? Can you hear me now? The Verizon ad. My name is Elliot. Every once in a while, people are surprised to see that I'm a woman, but it's a family name. It's such an honor to be here. I did grow up in Washington, and this is probably my favorite building in the whole city, just because, books. And when I used to come to the Library of Congress as a kid, I dreamed of having a book and having, an official Library of Congress number. And now I have one. It's amazing, It's very exciting. So I'm just going to read. My novel, You Are One of Them, is set partly in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s and partly in Moscow, Russia, in just after the Cold War in the mid-90s. And all you really have to know, I'm just going to read, I think, the third chapter. All you have to know is that the protagonist, Sarah Zuckerman, her best friend when she was a kid, who's a girl named Jennifer Jones, who is, I should add, loosely inspired by a real American girl named Samantha Smith. Anyway, in the book, Jennifer Jones and her best friend, Sarah Zuckerman, wrote letters to Soviet Premier Yuri Andropov in 1982 because they were worried about nuclear war. And only Jennifer received a response. Jennifer was invited to the Soviet Union on a kind of whirlwind ambassador tour and became this kind of international child celebrity until she died in a plane crash in 1985. And in 1995, which is when this chapter is set, the narrator, Sarah, who was always sort of upset about the fact that she kind of got left behind by her famous friend, receives a mysterious letter from Moscow that suggests perhaps her friend didn't really die. So is it a hoax? I don't know. You have to read it and find out. And a couple of people have said to me, oof, the way Moscow's portrayed in this book is really bleak. And I should say, I really love Moscow. I lived there for 2.5 years, and it's one of those cities that feels like home to me. So I do love the place, but anyway. There are gangsters in Moscow, my mother said when I told her I wanted to go to Russia. It was 1995, 6 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I had just graduated from college. My classmates set off for New York and San Francisco. Several of them went on to make millions at internet startups. But now that the Cold War was over, I wanted to see the former Soviet Union. I'd also begun to harbor romantic notions of journalism, and I'd heard that it would be easier to break into a newspaper there. A new English language daily was hiring expats. I even argued that my trip would help my mom's foundation. It had been exactly 10 years since Jenny's death, and a commemorative journey to Russia would be good PR. What I didn't tell her is that I had another reason for wanting to visit Moscow. A month before graduation, I'd received a strange letter. It arrived inside a manila envelope from my mother, who periodically forwarded mail that came to Washington. It drove me crazy that she never added a note of her own. She had never been the kind of parent who sent letters or care packages, but I would have settled for scribble on a Post-it. See you at graduation. This package, though, contained only a white envelope addressed to me in a broad, sweeping hand. Sarah Zuckerman, care of Jennifer Jones Foundation, P.O. Box 408, Washington, D.C., 20008, USA. The envelope had a corporate logo, but it was not one I recognized. DDBD in orange block letters, and beneath it in gray, Moskva. I'd fulfilled my foreign language requirement with 2 years of Russian, so I knew that Moskva is Moscow in the Cyrillic alphabet. I turned the envelope over. The return address was printed in the same corporate orange, Petrovka Ulitsa 26, Moscow, Russia. Dear Sarah, the letter said, you are Sarah, which is friend of Jennifer Jones. You organized Jennifer Jones Festival. I'm Svetlana, which is friend of Jennifer in Russia. We, with Jennifer, spent much time together when she came to USSR. We were on the pioneer camp. She often talked about you. I always want to meet with you. I know that you lives in Washington, in USA. Many people think that grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, but I not agree. Muscovites really love their city. This is why I invite you to Moscow. It is capital city like Washington. Since perestroika, it is easy for traveling here. I can organize for you special tour. I can tell you many things about Jennifer. Please to write to me. My address in web, svetlana.romanova@ddbd.ru. Officially, my mother organized the annual Jennifer Jones Festival, but she always forced me to say a few words at the opening ceremony, a ceremony that had seen increasingly lower attendance over the years. The year before, my remarks were addressed to 16 people, and most of them had wandered into the room by accident. But the writer obviously had a problem with her verb tenses in English. I was Jennifer Jones's friend. My mom started the foundation right after Jenny's death. Now she was already hard at work on plans for the 10th annual Jennifer Jones Festival. In fact, I had already ignored several frantic calls requesting my input. My mother's voicemail messages were delivered as if through a bullhorn. Jenny's legacy is in your hand, she said in one. She did not seem to understand that most people had stopped worrying about nuclear war. The Cold War was over. Anxiety about a hot war ended with it. I looked at the letter again. How bizarre I thought that someone all the way in Moscow could be reached instantly by electronic mail. Email was still a novelty in 1995. My high school friends and I used it to correspond from our various college campuses, but our messages retained the formal conventions of letters. They were long, began with proper salutations, closed with yours truly, and betrayed our collective uncertainty about this new technology. Did you get my last message, we wrote, or write back to let me know you received this? We often telephoned each other to verify that email had arrived. This was pre-Google, so we weren't yet relying on the internet to answer our every question. In fact, we weren't consciously using the internet at all, just our various college email servers. I had never heard the term website, let alone seen one. One of my friends tried to tell me about the seemingly mythical internet, and I nodded indulgently, certain it was something that would only capture the imagination of Dungeons and Dragons enthusiasts. Most emails I received were from on campus, many of them completely inane. You could target the whole student body by addressing an email to all:"stew, and these all stews range from announcements about various a cappella performances. Tonight in Kirkland Hall, Scott Hardy solos on Africa by Toto for the last time before he graduates. To drunken nocturnal confessions, yes, I'm gay, are you happy now? To prank messages sent from the accounts of those who had failed to log out of public computers. I'm proud to be a Sci-Uterus was a message that came from the account of a woman who spent a lot of time at Sci-U frat parties. I still felt a shiver of surprise when messages appeared in my inbox, especially when they had been sent from another city or state. And now it was possible to write an email to another country, and not just any country either, but to our former Cold War nemesis. When Sting wondered if the Russians loved their children too, he could not have imagined that we'd been emailing those Russian children. I don't know how Svetlana found me, but I recognized her name from Jenny's book. She was the girl plucked by the Kremlin to travel around with Jenny and her parents. After Jenny returned from the Soviet Union, a New York publishing house gave the Joneses a lot of money for a book detailing her travels. My trip to the Soviet Union consisted mostly of photographs of Jenny smiling outside various Soviet monuments and tombs of unknown soldiers. A ghostwriter was hired to tell her story. It began with this sentence: "It all started when I decided to write a letter to Yuri Andropov." There is no mention of the fact that it started when I decided to write to Andropov. There is no mention of me in the book at all. The book was rushed into production for holiday sales in 1983. Jenny gave me a copy for Christmas. It had a giant picture of her smiling on the cover, and inside she'd written, "I wish you could have come with me." If you look at the cover, you'll see the Jenny I remember. She was pretty in a wholesome, unthreatening way. Her cheeks dimpled, her glossy brown hair was always parted in the middle and pinned back with tortoiseshell barrettes. Her eyes were blue. Her expression tended to be open and warm. She wore classic American clothes, polo shirts and crew neck sweaters in primary colors. Central Casting could not have found a more ideal candidate to represent American childhood. Pictures of me at the same age, we were 10 when she was invited to the USSR, reveal a wan, wary child. Jenny and I were always about the same height. Her mother measured us every 6 months against a wall in their kitchen, and our pencil marks climbed in tandem, never more than a few centimeters apart. But while she was thin, I was so bony I looked emaciated. If I had been born just a few years later, I could have capitalized on the heroin chic trend. Even in photos of supposedly happy occasions, Christmas morning, my birthday, I am not smiling. This is partly because I had braces at the time and was reluctant to open my mouth in front of the camera, but mostly because I was a serious child. It's a good thing I wasn't the one who went on the tour of the Soviet Union. My sullen face wouldn't have won over the media or the Russians. Jenny was a natural diplomat. She was so photogenic that when she returned to the States, she was offered roles in several films. She might have grown up to be a movie star, like the other Jennifer Jones, the one who married Selznick. I didn't email Svetlana right away. I wasn't ready to dredge up the past. For years, I had kept a file box of Jenny memorabilia under my bed. I even brought it to college with me because I worried my mother would confiscate it for her collection. She was still petitioning the Smithsonian to create a Jennifer Jones exhibition at the Museum of American History. But I hadn't opened the box since I arrived on campus. After years of being known as the best friend of the girl who died, such a tragedy, everyone always said to me, it was a relief to finally be viewed as my own person. In college, I was Sarah Zuckerman, not Jennifer Jones's best friend. I made a point of telling no one I knew her, and to be honest, no one remembered her. She had been reduced to a footnote in the history of the Cold War. Once, during my freshman year, I asked the people at my dinner table if they knew who she was. Is she that girl in our psych seminar, the one who always wears her field hockey jacket? Asked one. Was she on that TV show, said another, the one about the girls' boarding school? A few people mentioned Jennifer Jones, the movie star, but most people responded with blank stares. As graduation loomed, I worried more and more about what I was going to do next. I felt qualified to do absolutely nothing, and the real world filled me with dread. In those days, resumes were supposed to include a list of all the computer programs you knew, as if Adobe proficiency were a predictor of success. And the fact that I knew only Word seemed proof that my liberal arts degree was worthless. I had no job and no plan. College was comfortable, so comfortable I had stretched out my time there, going abroad for so little academic credit that I had to remain on campus for a fifth year. I had always been young for my class. Now I would graduate like most students at 22. So I found myself thinking about Svetlana. I had been waiting for a letter from Moscow since 1983, and now that I'd finally received one, could I really ignore it? I went to the library computer lab and emailed her a week before graduation. Dear Svetlana, yes, I am the Sarah Zuckerman who helps organize the Jennifer Jones Festival. She was my best friend before she died. I've wanted to visit Moscow for many years. What do you mean exactly by special tour? Best, Sarah. It was her reply that made me determined to go to Russia. Dear Sarah, how do you know Jennifer Jones is dead? Because you saw on the television? You must believe also that your American cosmonauts walked on moon. Americans are like the kindergarten. You believe everything you see. Here in Russia, we know that news is not truth. When trouble happened, television here showed Swan Lake on all channels. Everywhere you look, it was Swan Lake. The last time Swan Lake was on the TV was during coup in 1991. There were tanks in the street, but on television, ballet. If you come to Moscow, I can organize for you to visit churches, theaters, Kremlins. It's very interesting time here. Sincerely, Sveta. Of course Jenny was dead. Her demise was part of my curriculum vitae. Her name was chiseled into me as if I were a memorial wall, so that even a blind person could feel the impression she'd made. Death had restored our friendship, like varnish on a weathered floor, and given me an easy explanation for my elegiac strains. I had a knack for grief. Reading Svetlana's email made suspension of disbelief awfully tempting, though. I'd always loved magic shows as a kid. How wonderful to watch things disappear and then presto, reappear again, good as new. Jesus' resurrection? Hocus pocus, I thought, but what an irresistible story. Roll back the stone, Mary Magdalene, and tell us about the empty tomb. Svetlana's insult about Americans seemed especially stinging since she had used incorrectly and all the more pointedly a definite article. There are no articles in Russian, so the difference between a and the can be perplexing. The kindergarten, she wrote, as if it were the only one, as if everyone in the United States were going down for an afternoon nap at the same time. Dear Svetlana, I wrote, American astronauts did walk on the moon. Perhaps you have not seen the footage of Neil Armstrong in 1969. I had been to the Air and Space Museum enough times to know the legend of the Apollo missions, and as for Jennifer Jones, I wrote, I was at her funeral. It was at the National Cathedral to accommodate the hundreds of mourners and press. The service was for all three of them, Jenny and her parents who died with her, but it was Jenny that the news crews were interested in. Jennifer wanted peace, the Bishop of Washington said, and now she has found it. My mother rolled her eyes. I still have copies of all the obituaries that ran in the papers. Jennifer Jones, 12, peace ambassador killed in plane crash, said the New York Times. It was a charter flight, scheduled to fly from Boston Logan to Waterville, Maine, because Jenny had been invited to address students at Colby College. She made a lot of appearances at schools around the country in those days. She'd narrate a slideshow of her trip to the USSR and then take questions. Your moon landing was Gollywood special effects, said Svetlana's reply. Because there is no equivalent of the letter H, Russians say Gollywood, not Hollywood. Stage spectacle to win space race. Oof, I was angry now. This person was comparing one of my country's greatest achievements to the like of a Jerry Bruckheimer film. I was about to type a flip response. Did you read that in Pravda? When the doubt crept in. Could I prove that we had actually landed on the moon? It was theoretically possible, I realized with a queasy feeling, that Neil Armstrong had taken those famous steps across the stage on a Hollywood backlot. It had never before occurred to me that we hadn't actually walked on the moon. It was one giant step forward for mankind, wasn't it? Was the supposed moon rock embedded in one of the stained glass windows of the National Cathedral just detritus from a local construction site? I felt like I did when I finally learned the truth about Santa Claus. It was humiliating to have been so naive, so full of faith. My second grade classmates scoffed at me. Why was I the last to know? I remember asking my mother. The thing is, they never actually found Jenny's remains. The plane that crashed was a twin-engine, unpressurized 15-seater, though only 4 passengers, Jenny, her parents, and her manager, were on board that day, and it went down off the coast. When the plane disappeared from the radar screen, a search went out, and the wreckage was found the next day, but the bodies were never recovered. And the cause of the crash remains mysterious. The plane was a Beechcraft 99, a model that was not large enough for the FAA to require a black box. So in the aftermath, the investigation was hindered by the absence of a cockpit voice recorder and flight data information. So technically, Svetlana was right. It was possible that Jenny didn't die. But you can't just write to someone out of the blue suggesting that her dead best friend is still alive. It was a cruel joke. I imagined my antagonist halfway around the world. She was almost certainly wearing too much makeup. The Russian girls I'd seen on TV looked like they were living in a funhouse mirror reflection of the 1980s. Blue eyeshadow applied with so little discretion that the effect was grotesque. Their garish painted faces were a distorted and terrifying image of capitalism. Gone to Moscow to see truth, Svetlana wrote. What was the truth? Jenny's death was front-page news in at least 30 countries. If she was alive, where was she? How could she just disappear without a trace? Moscow, said my friend Juliet when I told her my plans. Don't you want to go somewhere warmer? Somewhere with palm trees, maybe? Don't you know the Cold War is over? Moscow's the new Prague, said my friend Sam. The three of us were stretched out in the quad, plucking blades of grass as we spoke, vaguely aware that we would never again have so much time to kill. Our graduation was the next day. A lot of expats are moving there, I said. I didn't tell them that I'd been waiting to go there since 1983. Russian girls are hot, Sam said, at least until the babushka drop-off. What makes you such an expert on the life cycle of Russian women's looks, I said. The babushka drop-off is well documented. Russian women are insanely hot when they're young, and then at like 26, they turn into these fat old women wearing headscarves. There's no in-between phase. Sam's opinions came courtesy of his cousin Corinne, who had recently moved to Moscow to launch the Russian edition of an American fashion magazine. When I emailed her, Corinne offered me her guest room until I could find housing of my own. I have a place to stay, I assured my mother, with an American. I'll be safe. Thank you so much.
It's really a pleasure to read with Ahmed and with Elliot. And Elliot, I feel like I want to speak to the narrator of that novel because I was down in Richmond, Virginia, out in the county actually this summer. I was visiting a friend of mine's old grandmother, and we were lying in her backyard, and she said, "See that fence over there? It was a chain link fence." And I said, "Yeah, I see it." She said, "Well, that's where the moon landing took place." She said, they filmed it right back there. And I said, "How do you know that?" She said, "Because I found some aluminum foil and some Twinkie wrappers right after it happened." So I'm with Svetlana.
Everyone in Russia thinks we like.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here under the auspices of the Writers Center, which, when I first came back to D.C., I'm from here, was a place that sort of was a door that led me into literary culture in D.C., and which has become ever more vibrant in the many years I've been here since. I really feel quite committed to writing about certain places around D.C., as many writers do, you know, whether it's Edward Jones with Shaw or George Pelecanos in Prince George County or, you know, any number of places. And I feel committed to the places where I've wasted and thrown away most of my life. One of those places, I'm going to read you two very short stories, and very short, and from two different places. The first one is the little working class suburb where I grew up, right across the D.C. Maryland line. If you pass Morris Miller Liquor, you're on your way to the house where I grew up. And this is set a long time ago in the 50s. And that's all I think I need to say, except maybe that, you know, life gives us various things, whether you want them or not. Everybody knows that. And one of the things I got, and I'm grateful for it, was a really difficult mother. This is she. It's called Crêpe de Chine. Each night after dinner, my father went downstairs to his workbench to build birdhouses, which he fashioned from scraps of wood left over from pine paneling our basement. He was a connoisseur of birdhouses, my mother said. His favorite was a miniature replica of our ranch house with a tiny plexiglass picture window, a red Dutch door, and a shingled roof. It was a labor of love, he said, the night he completed it. My brother, Davis, went to his room where he listened to Radio Moscow on the shortwave. As for me, I cleared the table. "Sit with me, son," my mother said. "Let's pretend we're sitting this dance out." She told me I was her best friend. She said I had the heart to understand her. She was 46. I was 9. She sat at the table as if she were waiting to be photographed, holding her cigarette aloft. "Have I told you the story of my teapot?" she asked, lifting a Limoges pot from the table. She'd been given the teapot by her mother, whom we called Dear, Dear One, Dear Me, dearest of us all. Dear had just recently entered a sanatorium for depression after having given away some of her most cherished possessions. When she died at home a few months later, she had returned to her deteriorated Brooklyn brownstone, where she slept on a rollaway in the basement. My mother found she'd left an unwitnessed will written entirely in rhymed couplets. "I spent as I went, seeking love and content," it began. I think you could interpret that message. "No," I told my mother as I examined the teapot's gold-rimmed lid, "you haven't told me about it." But in fact, by then, my mother had already told me about almost everything. But I wanted to hear everything again. What else in Carroll Knowles, our sun-struck subdivision of identical brick houses, could possibly have competed with the stories my mother would summon from her china or her incomplete Sterling tea service, or the violet Louis Sherry candy box, where she kept her dried corsages. She whispered to me magic words: Crepe de Chine, Sherry Netherlands, Haviland, Stork Club, Argent Repousé. Night after night, she told me her stories. Night after night, I watched her smoke her endless parliaments, stubbing out the lipstick-stained butts in a crystal ashtray. We sat at the half-cleared table like two deposed aristocrats. She said her mother had once danced with the Prince of Wales. She said her father had shaken hands with FDR and Al Capone. She said she herself had once looked exactly like Merle Oberon. To prove it, she showed me photos of herself taken during her first marriage when she was barely 20. From every photo, she had torn her ex-husband's image, so that in most of them she was standing next to a jagged edge, and in some of them, a part of her body, where he'd had his hand on her arm perhaps, was torn away also. She said, life, 50-50, happiness and heartache. She said that when she was a girl, she kept a diary in which she recorded the plots of her favorite movies. She said that if I was lucky, I too would inherit the gift of gab. When I was little, she read me Good Night, Moon, Good Night, Nobody, Good Night, Mush, and good night to the old lady whispering, hush. But otherwise, she read me no bedtime books. She told me no fairy tales. Instead, she came to my room at night to tell me stories that began like these. Once upon a time, son, I had a gold brush and comb set. Once upon a time, my parents looked like Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. Once upon a time, I rode a pony in Central Park. Once upon a time, I had a silver fox coat. Things she told me, sitting on the edge of my bed at night. I was born with a call, son. That means I have a sixth sense. Or touching her perfumed wrist to my cheek. This is called Shalimar. Or faintly humming, do you know this tune? Do you know, when I grow too old to dream, I'll have you to remember? Or sometimes when she coughed, her nervous cough, her smoker's cough, she said, one day, after I'm gone, you'll hear a woman cough like this, and you'll think she is me. A neighborhood I like to write about a lot is... Oh yes, but you may not take it. My grandmother really did write it. She was a poet manqué, you know. I spent as I went, seeking love and content. It was on a cocktail napkin. It's better than getting stuff to get a will like that. Well, to me. I like to write a lot about DuPont Circle. When I moved back to DC after being overseas for many years, I moved back like the day before the AIDS epidemic struck, you know, and I felt then and feel still, you know, a sort of necessity to write all that down, and particularly in relationship to my neighborhood, my cemetery, you know, my ongoing life, you know, all those things. And this is set partly in Adams Morgan. Actually, if you happen to have been an Adams Morgan hanger-outer in the early 80s, you might remember Perry's, which was a roof deck restaurant, which is set there, and it's set in the Washington Hospital Center. And it's called Eduardo's Hair. And of course, because I had a great scheme where I was going to write about this, narrator was going to write about Eduardo, and he was going to write all these, like, I was going to write 300 stories or something, each very short, then put them all together, and we would go like, oh my God, it's genius. But I finished one. This is it. Eduardo's Hair. A year later, I found myself at a crowded beach party in a pine-paneled beach cottage, lying on a narrow bed beside a man named Paul, a friend of a friend, a model up from New York City for the weekend, who was pressing his ear to the fluted pink edge of a conch shell so he could hear the ocean sound of his own head. Oh, I kept thinking as I watched him, he has Eduardo's hair. I didn't know if I wanted to tell him this, since he wouldn't have known that Eduardo was the man I had loved all the difficult years before. In truth, I didn't know if those years were really over, and I didn't know if I would ever want to say to anybody again, "You sure have beautiful hair." I first met Eduardo in a piano bar when I was 33 and he was 34. I stood in a corner watching him while he talked and drank with some Latin guys I used to know. I'd love to touch his hair, I thought, thick and black with a faint trace of silver in each temple, barely noticeable, like a premonition. That was what desire was like back in those days, in case no one remembers. Sudden and absolute, so the sharp blue electric arc of wanting leapt quickly from the pole of impulse to the opposite pole of action. The next night we met for dinner in a rooftop restaurant that has long since gone out of business. When he leaned over the table toward me, I touched his hair. Over the next 7 years, I often had the opportunity to run a hand through his hair. At night sometimes when making love, or afterward shampooing each other in the shower. Or in the morning when we sat at the breakfast table, Eduardo hurriedly eating his cereal before work. I'd come up from behind and touch him on the head, and then, because he was an attorney who appeared often in courtrooms, I'd say, "Before you leave, don't forget to comb your hair." In the months after his diagnosis, I suppose I was thinking mostly of the time that would come when he would be sick and I would be the one to wash and cut his hair. For a long time, I was afraid of everything that was evidence of the physical life we shared. Our razors lying side by side on the porcelain sink, toothbrushes nestling in a water glass smeared with handprints, black hair strung in greasy knots that I sometimes pulled up while snaking the drain of the tub. At night, when I lay beside him, I was afraid of the things his body was emitting or sloughing off, like his cum puddling on his belly after he jacked off, or like the late night sweats that soaked the sheets in which we slept. My self-diagnosis, looking back, a fear of nail trimmings, a fear of mitosis, a fear of cells dividing and failing. What could I have said to him? Our language had always been touch, a late-night language with its own grammar of pleasure and consolation, its inflections of sorrow. I remember driving him home one night from signing the power of attorney and the document that would one day give me the right to decide when Eduardo would die. "Well," he said, after miles and miles. "Well, there." "Yes," I said. "That's right. There." In the last months of his life, I was afraid of the time when he would be neither here nor there. By then, his body had sloughed off almost everything, including the things he most needed. He weighed less than 100 pounds, and his skin bruised and bled each time the visiting nurse held his arms to hoist him from his bed onto the toilet. By then, his meals were delivered by an agency of caregivers. I just had to put the food on a plate and carry it up the stairs. Most nights, he raged at the health aides who came to flush his hep block and to bathe him. These aides were women from far away, from Nigeria, for instance, and Haiti. And sometimes, when I was lonely, I sat with them in the TV room, watching as they fiddled with their elaborately plaited and coiled hair. An ambulance took him to the hospital. I know what people saw that scared them when they looked into his room while passing down the corridor on the way to the coffee machine. His face, like a mask, stretched taut on a skull. Matchstick arms and legs affixed to a torso swollen with fluids, jaundiced skin, almost the color of mahogany. When he was awake, we watched TV or flipped through magazines. But when he slept, I was desperate to study his body. "Where are you taking us?" I wanted to ask it, or someone. The last day he had 3 seizures, one after the other, And then when they were finished, it seemed he'd at last sloughed off everything, except for his rages and their subsequent exhaustions. "Don't touch me, you fucker," he yelled at the orderly who was tying him down to his bed. He looked at me. "And what do you think you're doing? What the fuck do you think you're doing now?" I didn't know what to tell him because I knew it was wrong to restrain him when, after all, he was leaving his life behind. I said I was keeping an eye on him, as I'd always done. But he didn't believe it. He shook his head. No. "Calm down," I said. I put my hand on his forehead. "Eduardo, please calm down," I said. "I've come to comb your hair." Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. That was really quite wonderful. We have time for a little Q&A now. 5 minutes. Do we have a microphone? Terrific. So if you just raise your hand, I'll call on you, and then you can direct your question to whomever you think it's most pertinent to.
Anything.
I'm good at financial advice and love advice.
I'm really good at I'm good at fashion advice.
You are?
Yeah.
You're rocking that sling like I've never seen before.
You didn't know slings were in right now?
No, I didn't. But actually, when I saw you, I knew. Yeah, all right.
It seems as if all three of you have lived overseas for some period of time.
True.
And I was just kind of curious to know where and how long each of you lived and wherever you did.
Should we just go in order?
Yeah.
So I went to 7 schools in India before I was 11. And then I went to boarding school in the north of India, came here when I was 17, and spent my life pretty much on the East Coast, 25 years in Boston, and then moved up to D.C. So people ask me where I'm from, and I say D.C., and then they say, no, really, originally where are you from? I say, oh, originally Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Right.
Yeah.
I lived in Moscow for 2 years, and then I lived in London for 2 years, and then I lived in Amsterdam for a year. And then I actually, right before I came home to the States, where I lived in New York for 10 years, I spent a month traveling around southern India. So, but yeah, and I'm very interested in the way, sort of being an expatriate kind of changes your. I'm very interested in the way being an expatriate changes your understanding of self and also what it means to be American. I mean, James Baldwin said, and I think a lot of people feel this way too, that living in Paris was what made him really feel like an American. And I certainly felt that way. I was abroad for most of my 20s, and I never felt more American than I did when I was, anyway.
Richard.
I lived overseas for Ford and Carter. I came back just in time for the glorious Reagan years, which is why I look so happy now. I went to school in Germany, in Mainz, and then I worked for some years first in Spain, then in Sweden.
I was in Moscow when the whole Monica Lewinsky thing happened, and I remember my Russian colleagues all said to me, "What? Your president is real man. What is problem?" We would be so happy if Yeltsin was, because Yeltsin was like drunk all the time, and all my Russian colleagues were like, "Please, we would be thrilled to know our president was getting the blowjob in the." Can I say that? Sorry. Anyway, I just did.
Yeah.
Wait for the microphone.
I would have liked to have heard the conversation between Singh and the senator in your book. I'm curious to know how you characterize the senator in particular.
Thank you. So the question was, how did I characterize the senator in my book? Of course, you'll have to read it to find
Right.
out. But my wife, who's here, her family has had a house in Martha's Vineyard for decades, and so I'm part of the family now. So I go up to Oak Bluffs every summer, and if those of you who've been to the Vineyard, you know it's a very, very interesting place. The whole African American elite, they go to Oak Bluffs during the summer. In fact, there's a beach called the Inkwell, and coming from Boston, where like you can cut the racial tensions with a knife, I'd go up there and I'd tell my wife, like, wow, I've never seen so many like relaxed black people. I hadn't been to DC yet. And I was at a coffee shop in Oak Bluffs called Linda Jeans. And I saw this very powerfully built African-American man, and he didn't even have to ask to have his coffee cup refilled. The waitress would just come by and refill it, right? And he wasn't being very nice to her. He was kind of sitting with his legs apart, like, cutting into his pancakes. And he was with a very attractive younger woman who was smiling and trying to make up for his rudeness to the waitress. And I just saw this couple, and I thought, maybe she's his daughter. What's the deal? And I was just very intrigued by this couple and their dynamics and the way they walked out of that restaurant. And so I kind of based the Senator on these people. I don't know who they are to this day, but that's what novelists do. So that's not a suggestion.
I'm afraid it's time for only one more question. Who would like to? Yes.
Yeah, please.
Whether he writes poetry.
I started out as a poet. Actually, I work in all genres, poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. To me, it's all sort of the same, except for some obvious variations, but lines. But they're all, for me, I like compression quite a lot, and I like a certain level of lyricism. So,
Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Please don't forget to grab a copy of the Writers' Center Workshop and Event Guide. And thanks again to our wonderful audience.
So thanks so much to the Writers' Center and to Stuart. Stick around. In just a few minutes, we'll have our final panel. It is a panel with Slate Magazine and with Penn Faulkner, DC Fact Fiction. So don't go anywhere. We'll be up in just a few minutes.
All right. Hi, everyone. Hello. Welcome. Woo! Give it up. So hi, my name is Dan Coyce. I'm an editor at Slate, and I'm so grateful to everyone for coming to this panel called DC Fact Fiction, where we're going to be talking about DC prose, basically, DC fiction and nonfiction, with a side of poetry and drama, where it's been and where it's going, and what it's like to be a fiction writer living in DC. So thank you for coming. Let me introduce our panelists, starting from the far end down there. We have Maria Rana. Marie is a biographer, essayist, novelist, and former editor-in-chief of Book World at the Washington Post. Give her a hand. Give it up. Give it up. Next to Marie is Danielle Evans. She's the author of the short story collection Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self. She teaches at American. Please give her a hand. We're all getting paid based on how much applause we get. So. Next to Danielle is Louis Byrd. He's a novelist and critic for The Post, The Times, and elsewhere, and his new novel comes out next year. Give it up. And next to Lou is Jennifer Howard. She's a journalist and fiction writer whose work has appeared in the Washington Post, Book Forum, and many other places. Please give her a hand. So we have lots of things to talk about, and we're also going to take questions from you guys, so start thinking of embarrassing things you want to ask everyone on the panel. But to start out with, I didn't ask the four panelists to prepare a talk or anything specific, but I did ask each of them to think a little bit about maybe one Washington writer who they wanted to make sure was not forgotten in this conversation. You know, there are a lot of big names that I'm sure we will hit over the course of this, many of whom are alive and writing today, but I asked them each to maybe just think of one person who maybe even you may not think of necessarily as a Washington writer, but who does actually have deep Washington ties. So I wanted to start actually with Lewis. Lewis, you had someone particularly in mind that I thought would be a nice person to start out with, unless you changed it.
No, I didn't change. Okay. I wouldn't do that to you.
Yeah, thanks.
I wouldn't do that to you. My author, this does work. My author I'm going back to origins with Henry Adams. And back in 1880, he published anonymously a novel called Democracy, which is a kind of satire morality play about the power elite. It's about a young widow who relocates from New York to Washington, falls afoul of all the things that go on here, and in disgust, moral disgust, departs for Egypt at the end of the book, presumably to find a more functional government there. Two of the things that I think are interesting about this book in particular, one, James Adams was one of the very first writers that I know of to recognize that Washington as a city had the colors, had the people, had the themes that could make for good fiction. In just the same way as Paris did for Balzac and London for Dickens, Washington could form a real subject for an ambitious novelist. So that was an insight back at a time when Washington was considered, even more than it is today, a cultural backwater. And the second thing about it is that he created the template for the Washington novel, which is a term that I hope we can attack at some point of the day, because his idea of the Washington novel is very much the same as holds force today. It's basically involving government types. It's involving, and there be shadowy conspiracies, cabals, rogue generals, meetings in parking garages, and lately invasions of the White House. That seems to be the new staple. So I would love to talk about the Washington that exists outside of that very prescribed realm, which is personified by Henry Adams' modern heir, Mark Leibovich, who wrote a book called This Town, about really not this town, a phrase I've never used or my friends have ever used, but a vanishingly small percentage of Washington, D.C. But that's the part that people still see today. So,
yeah, and the Mark Leibovich is a really interesting example and I think that will be a great jumping off place later into a discussion of the Washington novel. And I think a lot of the writers that many of us up here on the stage love the most are writers who are pushing back very specifically against that image of Washington. And there's a really interesting blog post that someone wrote in the wake of the Navy Yard shootings. He was a former former congressional staffer who wrote a very interesting blog post about how the people killed in that event were not part of this town, right? They were people who lived in PG County or lived in the district and went into work, and they were staffers or federal employees working at their essential or non-essential jobs, or they were contractors and they went in and became a part of the city, but the chronicles that are told of this city are not their stories always. And so I would love for us to dig into that a little bit more. Marie, you want to talk about your
Yeah. First of all, I want to say it gives me such a thrill, such resonance to hear Lou, a Washington novelist himself, talk about Henry Adams and all that. You know, if you know Lou's work and then you know Democracy, Henry Adams' book, woo, lots of resonances are going on there. I would like to make a case for Sinclair Lewis. Now, a lot of people don't really realize that he was a Washington writer. He was born, after all, in Sauk Center, Minnesota, and he came to Washington in 1910, and he started this amazing run of novels, starting in Main Street, with Main Street in 1920, and then just one after another, Main Street and Babbitt and Aerosmith, and down the pike he went, and he was homing in on American commercialism, American materialism, all that crass, stuff that was so new at the time and so resonant, because there was no one so well read as Sinclair Lewis at the time. I mean, I think I read somewhere that his Main Street sold 2 million copies. I mean, imagine that happening today. That's a goodly figure, and he was considered a very wealthy man himself. So, if you look at him as a Washington writer, you actually see him echoing a lot of the stuff that was happening in Washington at the time, seen though through the small town prism. And so I like to think of Sinclair Lewis as someone who actually may not have been able to write what he wrote unless he'd been here in this city, you know, reverberating that little small town Minnesota mentality in a place as important and majestic as Washington.
It's useful to remember, I think, that Washington is not just the seat of government, but is often the seat of protest against that government. As I was reminded as I drove down Independence today and saw the truck with Stop Obamacare and Judgment Day with judgment spelled wrong, just parked right in front of the Freer and Sackler Gallery where it's always parked. And so, I mean, Lewis, even in his Nobel Prize speech, was very critical of not just the American government, but the American temperament. And Washington, it can really be a home for that kind of dissent in a way that I think some of the best fiction written here and nonfiction written here really captures. Jennifer.
Well, the writer I have in mind was also very closely involved with the life of the government, but in a much less glamorous way than Henry Adams, you know, who lived right across from the White House, was really cheek by jowl with the elite and the power brokers. The writer whom I had in mind lived on the cheap in boarding houses, eked out a living as a civil servant for 10 years. He was a patent clerk in several offices. That's Walt Whitman. Was here for 10 years, which, you know, when I think of Walt Whitman, I first think of Camden and I think of more northern locales. But of course, he's very closely involved with the Civil War. Came here at the end of 1862 to find his brother George, who'd been wounded fighting for the Union. Came down and, of course, spent a lot of time trying to bring comfort to soldiers in the hospitals that were set up, including many very close to here, you know, Lincoln Park. He would make these pilgrimages to sit by the bedsides of the soldiers and write letters and read to them, and really was very selfless, I think, in trying to help comfort these people who were fighting for the life of the country. But like all writers, he had to make a living. You know, it's not an easy thing. Leaves of Grass is a wonderful book, but it wasn't exactly, you know, Danielle Steele as far as income streams. So he went to work for the government, and he worked at a very humble, he worked as a patent clerk, a very low level, but the kind of people who make this city run. I mean, this is, you know, we're facing at midnight a shutdown. People who, the lives and careers, temporarily, we hope, very temporarily, of people like Whitman who gave a lot of time and a lot of their working hours and care to keeping the government going at the most basic level. So it seemed fitting to bring Whitman into it. I think Washington, especially outside the Beltway, has a reputation of being kind of a soulless city, which anybody who lives here, spent time here, knows that's not true. But Whitman, I think, to me, you know, brings such soul to the struggles of democracy and watching the country try to tear itself apart. And he actually had a very productive 10 years in Washington. I learned he wrote about 100 poems, including "Oh Captain, My Captain" and "When Lilacs Last in the Courtyard Bloomed." He revised Leaves of Grass twice, and he did that book of sketches of democratic life, which again is really kind of a soul-searching of what it means to be a democracy. And so I thought he would be my choice.
Yeah, it does seem that living in Washington often gives writers the chance to think not just about the power brokers, but about what it means to be an American and the American character. And it seems to influence their work in interesting ways. Danielle.
So I wanted to talk about Frederick Douglass. Another writer that we sort of claim as a DC writer in spite of his work spanning lots of areas and his life spanning lots of areas. But, you know, the biography that hopefully everybody has read at some point is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. But I want to talk about the fact that he rewrote that book several times. What interests me in the scope of the conversation about DC writing and DC writers is especially the third biography, because the facts of his life don't change that much, but the framing does. And that sort of consciousness about framing, that sort of conscious attention to what narrative gets you seems to me, of course, a problem that all prose writers deal with on some level, but also a very kind of DC problem, and a problem that specifically arises for Douglass because of his public life and because of the increasing pressure on his public life to reconcile his existence in different spheres, his sort of very public, very formal Washington career appointments, and his emergence as sort of the first very public African-American leader, and all of the sort of tensions and demands that creates in his life. you see in the work, and you see in the reframing and the attempt to go from this sort of fire of narrative to an attempt at reconciliation. And I think any novel that's about this city, that's very deliberately about DC, is on some level an attempt to reconcile these sort of different narratives that we have about ourselves as a country, about ourselves as a city, about who we are in different spaces within it. So it strikes me as really interesting to think about Douglass as a DC writer, and Douglass, I mean, Henry Louis Gates has called him the origin of African-American writing, but also as of African-American fiction, but also the origin of a kind of DC tradition. And it seems not accidental to me that, two of the most prevalent literary traditions in this city are African-American literature and LGBT literature, right? Because there is this sort of way in which the consciousness of power also asks writers to be conscious of the ways in which they are empowered or disempowered, and the ways in which their narratives are read as public narratives. So I thought we could talk about that. So.
Yeah, I love the point about the framing and reframing of one's public story versus one's private story being such a Washington thing, and I think that is true. I mean, maybe more so than any American city other than Los Angeles or Hollywood specifically. But there is this sense in which simply by the very fact of living in DC, you've become part of the public life of this nation. And so that's something that people deal with in their lives, people who live here, but it's also something that people deal with in their fiction and in their nonfiction. And that brings me to something that I really wanted to maybe kick off our discussion by talking about before we get back to a lot of these issues, which is to think about not just the literary fiction author in DC, but to think about the literary nonfiction writer, Frederick Douglass being a very early example before there was even really such a term. But the city has produced a lot of political philosophers and great thinkers and also crackpots. And there's also, but most especially I think in the last 30 or 40 years, it's produced a whole sort of trove of literary journalists who are writing incredible reported narrative or memoir, investigating their own lives or others. And I think about people like Catherine Boo during her time at the Washington Post, or other Post writers like David Marinus. And I think that because of the strong journalistic tradition in the city, I think that's an avenue that I would really love to explore. And so do any of you have writers who leap to your mind in this specific world of the literary nonfiction story that could only really happen in Washington or come out of Washington that you would be interested in talking about? Marie?
Someone who springs to mind immediately is Margaret Leach, who wrote a wonderful book called Reveille in Washington. I think it must be at least 30 years old, if not older. But in it, she describes the Washington that Jennifer just described, Civil War, how the city became this grand hospital is what it was, and how it dealt with the Civil War. And it's just a phenomenal book of reportage, and it really captures a sense of the Washington of its time. And I think that that's probably one of the best nonfiction books about Washington I can think of.
It won a Pulitzer, didn't it?
It did.
The 40s? Yeah.
It did indeed, yeah.
Well, in Washington, for historians and writers of historical narrative, Washington is such a gold mine, just because there's so many research opportunities available here in places like this, in the Library of Congress and all over the city. And I mean, it informs the fiction too. I mean, you think about someone like Edward Jones, who makes the historical research that he does. He doesn't even exactly weave it into his work so much as he just baldly states it in a very confident way to make specific points about the stories that he's telling. And I think that's a great example of a great historical narrative, a contemporary narrative, or a series of contemporary narratives that I always loved about Washington was Meg Greenfield's work, which did sort of straddle the Washington novel world, but also the real living Washington world in really interesting ways. And she was someone who knew the city really well and knew the corridors of power really well, but also, I think, was just as interested in the way that actual human beings lived.
It strikes me that it can be a downside to be, there is this rich journalistic tradition here and a lot of investigative resources, archival resources, but that closeness to power can really be a corruption for a writer. I mean, in our own time, we certainly have seen, not to unfairly single out, say, Bob Woodward, but there's that, to unfairly single out Bob Woodward.
It's not unfair.
There's I mean, and I don't know, I'm of a mixed mind, but you know, you get access to power and then you become very close to it, and it's interesting to watch the evolution of a career like that, where he gets closer, and, you know, he started off really as an outsider, somebody who was a muckraker, essentially, and then closer, you know, he gets great stuff by being close to power, but at what point do you become too close? It's an interesting question for me.
He's certainly been straddling that line uneasily, I think, for many readers for 20 plus years. I mean, the sense you get in reading his books and his reporting that he gets stuff that no one else could, but what is he not getting, or what is he not telling you? What was the cost of getting that stuff and being so close?
Yeah. I mean, he may get better. I'm sure he gets things that he would never get any other way.
Oh, yeah.
But the cost is to the people who don't talk to him, because they're the ones who don't get to tell the narrative. So
right.
They're usually almost always on the losing end of his books. Yeah. I was going to say that tradition extends back, at least as far as Theodore White, who was writing the Making of the President books back starting 1960, I think it was, and first kind of hit on that formula of a really intense immersion in the substance of politics, both national and DC based. That Woodward and all these others are carrying on, this idea of the politics itself. It was fascinating, just no matter what angle of it you're taking, macro or micro. So.
Right, that the chess match of election
Yes.
is just as interesting as the actual mechanics of governing.
Or the ideas of governing, and
right.
that's what dominates our journalism now in their coverage of elections. Yeah.
Someone else who's written, I think, a good bit, mainly in journalism, about Washington, and I think very well, very probingly, is Gore Vidal, who of course wrote he also wrote a novel about Washington, which was, I think it was Palimpsest, was his novel about Washington?
That was a memoir, but he's written,
that was his memoir, and it was about society and moving through society and whatnot, but he has written so, I think, revealingly about the power structures and the seduction of power. It's worth mentioning Gore.
Well, I mean, he was sort of uniquely positioned in that he so clearly, through his career, worshipped power, but also was completely enraged by it. So you get a really great sort of uneasy look at whatever power structure he's looking at in his novels or in his reportage. But I think that's a good, I think his Washington novel was sort of a cheeky version of the Washington novel, Lewis, that you mentioned before.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'd love to talk about that specific thing, that object that is sort of like that's the view of Washington, not only in literature, but in TV and movies, that I think is that the vast majority of the book buying public experiences a world in which, you know, the White House is taken over, or deals are made in the secret corridors of power by people walking and talking right next to each other while the camera follows them, or just this sense that the city is this totally inaccessible place run by people in shadowy rooms, and they're intending to give you a look inside that, but really it's just about how you are excluded from that world, you know, and I just think Leibovitz is such a great example of a nonfiction version of that. I mean, it opens up at Tim Russert's funeral.
Yes.
And that was like the ultimate exclusive, inclusive Washington event, right? It was at National Cathedral, and there were like 600 or 700 or 1,000 or 2,000 people there, but it still was a place to see and be seen. And what do you guys think it is about Washington, about the corridors of power, that causes a reading public to sort of want these stories, whether nonfiction or fiction, about the shadowy people who make the decisions that affect them every day? Is it just simply that everyone feels like they don't understand the world and someone can finally tell them how it is?
Maybe there's a sense that we would like to think there is somebody pulling the strings of the political puppets. I mean, sometimes you read the stories that come out of Congress, especially lately, and you think, is anybody running this really? So, you know, if there is some sort of shadowy puppet master or cabal or
there may be a cabal, but at least someone's in charge.
The power behind the speaker's chair. You know, it's almost reassuring in a way, the way a detective novel, you know, yes, there's horrible stuff in the world, but it will get resolved because here's the explanation of why it happened, you know. Maybe there's some of that.
I was saying it also reflects to me the very deep animus that so many Americans now hold toward Washington, D.C., the official emblem of Washington, D.C. There's a sense that, yes, everything has gone wrong, and here we're going to see exactly how it's gone wrong, and this is why our government sucks. And so it comes to me, there's a great deal of hostility in a lot of these new, particularly the invasion of the White House movie. This is almost like a wish fulfillment fantasy for a lot of viewers out there. There's a sense that this is a rotten system, the same sense that Henry Adams had, and needs to be exposed, brought to the light.
I think it's also just a level at which, from a narrative perspective, it's easier to make shadowy intrigue sexy than it is to make bureaucracy. Like, I'm trying to write a sort of Washington novel right now, and there's a long plot about the passage of legislation, and do you know how hard it is to make that interesting? But it's important to it's important to the plot, and it's also important because there are lots of characters who are sort of vaguely affected or working on this legislation because it seems sort of honest to who lives in this particular neighborhood. There's a lot of people who have tremendous investment in what they're doing, but it also, there's a certain level on which you have to, unless you're writing nonfiction or intending fiction to be sort of very direct commentary on present political action in DC, you have to get away from it a little bit, and maybe the Washington novel is just sort of getting very far away from it. Because part of the problem I had with writing a novel that's set in DC in the present is that there did need to be some acknowledgement of the federal government existing, but I was not particularly interested in cataloging the existing federal government.
Right.
So I had to invent another administration, which inherently makes it almost sci-fi, right?
Right.
Because this DC without the Obama administration is not this DC anymore. But I didn't necessarily want to be directly writing about the Obama administration, and so that, I think that there's a certain level on which you have to sort of decide how much you're willing to change, and anything you change sort of changes the texture of the city, which I think is not true of literature of other cities. You could write literature and set in lots of places and change who the president was and not have it sort of reverberate throughout the rest of your book.
Right. And then in opposition to that idea of the Washington novel, or that cliche of the Washington novel, are a lot of writers, as I mentioned, that I think a lot of us wanted to talk about a lot on this panel. People like Edward Jones, right, who's telling stories in which the president only appears as the reason why people who don't live in Washington think Washington must be some kind of amazing fantasy land for black people, right? I remember in All I Hang Our Children, there's several different times people say, well, Washington must be an amazing place to live because they're not going to treat black folks badly in the place where the president eats his breakfast. But other than that, the people in those stories are more or less completely uninterested in the so-called official life of Washington, the thing that most Washington writers, or maybe not most, but the most popular Washington writers view as what the city is all about. So I'd love to maybe just talk about Jones a little bit and about his specific relationship with Washington, which struck me from the first as being very much about his research, about how specific he wants to be in his stories and his books with addresses, with census figures, and the authority that he takes from having that sort of bone-deep sense of the Washington, D.C. that people have been living in forever, and uses it to inform those stories. So let's talk about him a little bit. How do you think Edward Jones thinks about Washington, D.C., both as it was in the past of some of his stories and as it exists in the present day in some of his stories? What kind of place is his Washington, D.C.?
I think what knocked me out about Edward P. Jones was that he saw exactly the opposite of that sort of Peking opera version of Washington, in which, you know, you have this forbidden city with the emperor and the empress, and there's all this echo chamber of power, but there's no sort of human element. And Edward P. Jones turned that upside down. It was a city of human beings. It was neighborhoods. And it is. I mean, you read Edward P. Jones and you know. I mean, I live in the Shaw neighborhood, and I just can see the places that he's writing about and the places that I walk through every day. It's very real, it's very human, it's very down to earth. It is everything that the Peking Opera of Washington is not. And I think that was the thing that absolutely blew open for me, the city in a different way. George Pelecanos did it as well. But Edward P. Jones in this, so this Washington that we all live in, that we all recognize, that we all see, but that we hadn't read stories about, you know.
It's Washington is home.
Yeah.
I grew up in D.C. over in Northwest in Palisades, and Washington is just home. It is the place you grew up. So when you mentioned research, and he may have done, gone back and refreshed his memory, but it does not feel like research is driving Jones's stories. He's writing about the people he knew, the places the blocks he grew up on as a kid, the figures who came and went. It's a real, it's the way John Cheever writes about Connecticut. It's so fully inhabited, and it's coming out of some very deep experience. This is life, and it's wonderful because Washington is home to hundreds of thousands of people, and outside the Beltway, nobody really thinks of it as anybody's hometown.
Right. I feel like there's more characters who are actually born in Washington, D.C. in Edward Jones's books than in maybe all the other books that other writers have written put together. Like, Washington has always traditionally been a place of outsiders who come in and do things and then leave, but there are people who are born here, live here, and die here, within a few steps of where they grew up, and he's telling those stories.
Another thing I really love about his stories is how they document the changing urban, the fabric of the city. He writes about blocks that have been torn down, around the convention center. I live just down here on Potomac Avenue. He writes about people coming through the neighborhood and establishments that aren't there or that were there. You get a real sense of how the city, as an urban landscape, has evolved over decades. What's lost, what's changed, sort of who's where, and that's such a big part of Washington's story. If you all know the book Capital Losses, which is just full of landmarks that are no longer there, some very small, some big, but again, in the popular, outside the Beltway, you hear that people think Washington Monument, they think the Capitol, they think the monuments, and don't see block by block the kind of real, density and history that we have here. Jones is great for that.
I was going to say that getting onto what you said, that he puts everything in such an amazing historical continuum, his whole body of work. You can't talk about modern day Washington without talking about the Civil War, about talking the slavery, and if, for instance, the end of the known world, at least one of the characters escapes to freedom in Washington, D.C. and becomes a freedwoman. Is at least one or two?
Well, one of the people is, because I was going to talk about the end.
Yeah.
Because what got me to Douglass this morning was thinking about the end of the known world and how these two characters end up in Washington both as a space to consciously reinvent yourself.
Yes.
One of them being the escaped slave, and one of them being the sort of one of the black slave owners who suddenly, in this space where that identity that was power in one sphere is shame in another. But I mean, I think for obvious reasons, when we think of Jones as the DC writer, we think of the story collections. But the known world, because of that ending, and because of that ending as a sort of sense of what's possible in DC is this reinvention that does involve a certain kind of disavowal of the past, but also as a sort of really deep critique of institutional power, and power as a kind of identity and as a sphere and not as any sort of specific thing, does strike me as also a really DC book. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying, the corrupting force of power, too, on blacks and whites alike.
Yeah, and that those characters end up in DC is very notable, considering that DC serves for so many of the characters in his work over and over again as sort of like the natural end point for the diaspora of Southern blacks, right? That's where they keep ending up, and he has that line. I don't just know this offhand. I wrote it down because I was rereading the book the other day. But at the end of Tapestry, one of his stories in All Anne Hagar's Children, he talks about a whole train full of people coming from the South up to D.C. And that they had this connection of the old Southern ways of life. And then there's this line in here that just killed me, which is, the cohesion born and nurtured in the South would be but memory in less than 2 generations. And so he's writing about a city where those old bonds have started to fall apart, and people are creating new bonds all around them, of neighborhoods or of love or hate or violence or work, but they're working out a new way to be. They're reinventing themselves, as you said, Danielle. And I think that's a really potent story of what Washington is for a lot of people, not just for mid-century African Americans in the city, but for a lot of people who come to Washington or even who are born here. Marie, you mentioned George Pelecanos, and I'd love to touch on him briefly a little bit too. There are a lot of things to talk about in Pelecanos' work, but one thing that I like about him that reminds me of your work, Danielle, is that he has a very specific recognition that that the story of DC does not necessarily end at the DC line, right? That there's a porousness, an emotional and a very real porousness to those borders, that the people who live on one side or other of, like, say, for example, the PG County and the DC line, it doesn't matter that much to their everyday lives, and it's one enormous community that's all interacting with itself. You know, and those characters are also very aggressively uninterested in sort of the supposed business of official DC. They're living their lives and doing what they have to do to get by. And so what do you guys think about Pelecanos' use of the city and also his use of specific historical eras in the city to tell different stories? You know, he sets stories in the 70s and the 50s and the 80s, and he's lived in a lot of those eras, but he's also obviously picking them specifically to tell these particular stories. That's a totally inchoate non-question. Go ahead.
I don't think he entirely picks them because of the music, but sometimes I get the sense that he really loves the music of, he wants to kind of have the soundtrack of the 70s on while he writes the novel.
Right.
So, which I think is great, actually, but I think he's really, I mean, it's also his vintage, again, that, you know, he's kind of recreating things that, not exactly what he knew, but that the culture, the larger culture.
Mm-hmm. What I love about his work, I mean, a lot of things, but it's ironic that we needed a Greek American to do this, but he's shifted the locus of the DC novel, if you will, east of the capital. I was reading Dan Brown's The Lost Symbol. There's a point where, there is a point to this. There's a point where the character is crossing Anacostia.
Washington novel, it's a Washington
exactly,
novel.
Classic Washington novel.
Yeah.
A character is crossing Anacostia Bridge and finds Maryland on the other side. It was a more abiding mystery than anything else in the book was what happened to Ward 8. Where did Ward 8 go? And that to me is so emblematic of what the traditional Washington novel does. It just basically scissors off that whole part of the city. It doesn't exist anymore. There are no people out there. Kerry Washington in Scandal, where does she live? Probably in some very Tony Northwest. Yeah. It has no connection to the rest of the city. So so he's done a wonderful job, and he's used genre to do it. He's brought people in not through the traditional sociological means, but by telling really crackling good crime stories, and that's always often the best way to get people to look.
Yeah, I mean, I also really appreciate his command of the city. I think it's fake metro stops that get me.
Oh no!
The metro doesn't go there. You have
Georgetown.
To take the bus.
I wanted to touch a little bit on, because several of you on this panel are fiction writers living here. You know, there are some other cities right here on this very coast of America who might sometimes diss the district as something of a cultural wasteland. It's possible, it could happen. You know, but I think that a lot of what we see, those of us who live here, is a city that is not just rife with stories, but is specifically a good place to be a writer. And so I'd love for those of you I think all of you have written fiction, to talk a little bit about what it is specifically about the city that inspires your storytelling, whether it's set here or not, and what it is about living here that makes it easier or more fun or more enjoyable or more interesting to be a writer than it maybe otherwise would be.
Is now the time to plug the Library of Congress?
I think so, yeah.
I live 6 blocks away. This is an amazing resource. It's an extraordinary resource. The librarians and the resources themselves. I can't imagine not having this resource. It's amazing. But I'll just say, because I write historically, that the general antiquity of living in DC, the walking around and seeing 100-year-old, 150-year-old homes everywhere you go, you feel like you have bridged a certain gap in time just by living here. And you're walking down the mall, you're walking in the shadows of extraordinary figures. When you're standing by the Lincoln Memorial, you know that Martin Luther King was there. So the history follows us wherever we go in DC. There's almost no place that is ahistorical here.
I think as a writer who thinks a lot about voice and point of view, it's useful to live in a city where every space is contested space on some level and very sort of openly
contested space.
Contested space. You can't sort of make declarative statements about DC without really being conscious of the point of view that they're being made from. And I think that keeps you on your toes as a writer because there's a lot of sort of, the book that I'm writing now got bigger and bigger in part because it became more consciously about DC and it required more voices to tell that story because any one of them would have been sort of limited in a way that felt myopic. And I think that awareness of the history of the space, of all the things that every space has been, but also all the sort of competing things that they represent in any given moment in the present is really useful. And also it's, we're not New York, but we have a tremendous literary community. And I think that there are, just like, and people come through all the time. There's a great body of writers working in DC, and there are also, I teach this class called Writers in Print in Person, where I can sort of summon people and ask them to come talk to my students for free. And you can get people to come to DC, and that's not true. I used to teach in the Ozarks. I could not have taught that class there.
Just Danielle Woodrell every week.
Every week.
Yeah.
And the book festival, for God's sakes. Yeah.
I think it's very liberating to be to be a writer in a town where writing is not the game in town. My impression is you go to parts of Brooklyn and everybody's a novelist, and everybody else's cousin is a novelist or an agent, or you live next. You can't throw a stone without hitting three novelists, an agent, and a publicist. And that may be wonderful for some writers, but I think it's very mentally very liberating to be in a place where no one really expects you necessarily to be writing fiction, where it's not the industry, everybody's so focused on politics that you can kind of find your own creative and imaginative space without too many trappings of the business of writing. The writing, of course, has, if you want to publish, whatever, these are considerations that will follow you anywhere you go. So I think it's nice to be able to go to a dinner party at the house of someone you don't know, and it's lobbyist, lawyer. Oh, you write? What do you write?
See, nice. Yes, that is the exact opposite of dinner parties in Brooklyn, where lawyers are like, "Oh, you're a lawyer."
Well, for me, maybe not for others, but I am so unconscious when I make decisions about what I'm going to write. I don't make decisions, is what I'm trying to say. It's a very unconscious process. And sometimes I need for people to ask me, was it Washington that made me write X? And sometimes I'm surprised by my own answer, which is, when I think about it, yes. The reason why I started writing about race, which was the subject of my first my memoir, as being Hispanic, was because in Washington, you were, people said, you're Hispanic. And I said, who, me? And in fact, nobody asked me that in New York. Nobody asked me that anywhere else I lived. But in Washington, it was like, oh, this is interesting. And so I think that somehow Washington gave me that subject. And then somebody said to me, you just wrote a biography of Simón Bolívar. Is that because you're so consumed by power living in Washington? And I thought, well, yes, I think that's true. I think that to some measure, that's right. I was interested in the whole notion of, dictatorships, power, the governing rule. So I think in some ways, you may not know what is going on in your head as a writer in Washington, but it has its definitely its permeating effects on your consciousness.
Danielle, you mentioned the literary community here in Washington, and I'd love to touch on that a little bit more. I am not a fiction writer, and so I think I have less of a great sense of what the community of writers is like here in the city. Where do you guys think, are there physical places that are the centers of this community? Is it as simple as like Politics and Prose in the Writers Center, or is it Comet Ping Pong, or is it Busboys and Poets? Where are the places in your your knowledge, or is it just the internet? Is the answer the internet?
Peregrine Espresso down on That's where Louie and I
That's our
hang
hangout.
I
yeah.
see.
That's our hangout.
If you're looking for literary culture, look for these guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Politics and Prose has really done a fabulous job of staying in business for one thing, but, but also being a real hub for both big name, marquee names and people you haven't heard of but should have, people you're thrilled you now know about, real meeting place for writers and authors and their readers. I'm always grateful to them for being here.
Oh, yeah.
To also make a plug for the universities, I mean, all of them bring through a number of tremendous people every year. And I think sometimes that space is underutilized because so many of our campuses are sort of not in the center of things.
Right.
That people don't always think, oh, like they're open to the public. But, check out AU and GW and Howard and UMD. They all have tremendous, and George Mason, if you can get out that far, but they all have really tremendous, I'm saying that as a person who's about to be exiled to Virginia again, like today. I'm in the middle of a move and I just realized I have my sweater on inside out, and please forgive me. I'm disoriented. But I think that there's a lot happening there. And also there are more and more independent reading series. I mean, of course, the bookstore reading series, both Busboys and Politics and Prose are amazing. There's also a series called 3/10, which is run by one of our former AU MFAs. But,
Say the name of that series again.
3/10, which meets at the Big Hunt, so there's beer there. And has actually gotten a lot of sort of national recognition on kind of up-and-coming reading series, indie blogs, that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of different literary space happening in DC, which I think is...
Penn Faulkner.
I was just going to say, one of the reasons we're here today, and the Library of Congress of readings and talks.
There's a lot when you sit and think about it, but you're right, we don't have the same reputation of
Right, and it's interesting, though, that so many of the spaces that you guys talk about are places where you can go see other writers read, but what DC doesn't necessarily have that I know of, and maybe, as you say, Jennifer, this is a relief, is it doesn't have that Brooklyn-like intensity of, oh, here's a place where you're just going to walk into this foment of writerness, where everyone is working on something and there are a million people to bounce your ideas off of. I mean, traditionally in a lot of cities, MFA programs fulfill that role, or at least sort of serve as a seed to that role. And there are MFA programs in DC, or in the DC area, but to me, often they don't always seem necessarily enmeshed in the writing community. I say that as a graduate of one of them. And maybe I'm wrong, because that was a long time ago, but do you think that there are things that the local writing programs could be doing to build that network more, or to become part of that community more, or do you think they're actually doing a great job and I'm full of it?
I come from such a household of naysayers. I am trying to get away from the foment of writerness that you just said. Living in, for so long, as Jennifer knows, at the Washington Post Book World, where there was a constant river of books. I mean, we were getting 200 books a day. It was like the deluge. We were doing triage all the time. And then coming to the Library of Congress, which is in itself this tremendous temple of books and wisdom. You just, feel the place humming. And then to go home, and I am married to a writer, a critic, someone who devotes himself to books. I can never get away from it. So, as my dear husband says, there is no literary community in Washington. There is no no salon culture. It just isn't here, and it's a good thing that it isn't here. It liberates you in many, many ways. So.
One thing, I'm sorry. Poets. Yeah.
Wonderful. Glad to hear about that.
I was also thinking of the theater culture here, which may not have always direct ties to the fiction writing community, but it's become such a great theater town, both at the very visible level, Shakespeare Theater Company and what goes on at the Folger and all that, but troops like Taffety Punk and some of the other more grassroots cultures that are real theater troops that are keeping the spoken word and the acted word in everybody's minds.
Yeah, and from a playwriting standpoint, specifically, Washington is, I would argue, the best city in America for developing new playwrights. I mean, more theaters here give more money and actually put up plays by new playwrights than anywhere, including in New York. Yeah. I think that's a a dramatic part of the city that people sometimes forget about.
I do want to add on to what Marie was saying. It's like that writing is a solitary occupation at the end of the day, so I would find a salon culture oppressive too. I would just I just want to be home, writing or reading or doing the things that writers do. And I'm not sure I'm into the competitive culture that probably exists in Brooklyn, places like Brooklyn, where you have all these writers clamoring for a small pool of attention.
Having spent several years in Iowa City, I'm not sure that coffee shops full of writers actually facilitate.
Right.
I mean, they facilitate lots of other things, but I don't know
They
that
facilitate
writing.
poverty. The poverty and the jitters.
I wonder if there's anything now like what Sterling Brown used to have salons essentially in his house. Poet, longtime professor, and I wonder if there may be things like that taking place now that I don't really know about, where politicians and journalists and writers would come together, academics, and have discussions.
The Washington Post tried to make that happen, but then they got yelled at for it.
Yeah.
And speaking of the Post, many of us here on the panel are critics, and I wanted to specifically point out, in talking about the way the literature is dealt with here in the city, that despite the end of Book World, the Post still does a really quite spectacular job of running a lot of reviews of a lot of books and a lot of really interesting reviews of a lot of really surprising books. They just cover a lot of stuff. I'd be curious, are there other DC area publications, online or offline, that you guys really love reading or that you guys tune into that people out there in the audience might want to know more about? I personally once loved Mark Athatakis' blog, but now it's sort of on hiatus.
He's moved.
And he moved to Phoenix. Yeah, sadly he moved to Phoenix, like last month. But there are people writing about literature here in DC and about writing, and are there people who you think other people here should know about?
There's a very nice sort of building online site called the Washington Independent Review, which is growing, and I think it does run some very, very solid, wonderful reviews. And it also holds, it just started, I think it was last year, it started a book conference, a writing conference, a writers conference, which will happen last March, and it will happen again next March. And I think it's something worth supporting as a community, that it exists only online, it doesn't exist in print, and in this conference that is held every year. So I think that's worth looking into and supporting.
The city paper does a really good job of plugging and covering events, and they recently had a couple months ago a special on DC fiction and a DC short story contest. So, they're keeping abreast of things. I think it's worth checking.
It's harder and harder to think of literary criticism as locally based for me because so much of it is online now, and it's everywhere, which is wonderful. It's a great abundance of wonderful stuff out there to read. It's not necessarily coming out of Book World anymore, or many good things do still come out of Book World. But I don't tend to think of literary criticism as geographically based anymore, unless I think of maybe the British reviewing tradition as opposed to the American tradition, and they're somewhat different.
The one exception might be the radio programming, the Diane Rehm show, for instance. Once a month, does she do her book club? And that's a very intense analysis of the given book of the hour. It's something you're not likely to find in a lot of outlets. So we find it where we can, I guess.
All right, well, so we have about 7 or 8 or 9 minutes left, and I wanted to open it up to questions. Those of you in the audience who have questions, we have a microphone, which our lovely MC will carry over to you. Yes, sir.
You actually preempted my question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Feel free.
Most of you have had a brush with the Washington Post in some way. And I've wondered how much of a factor the Post has been in the development of a district literature and what the prospects would be under the new Amazon management.
Some of us, until recently, were owned by the Washington Post, sir. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about that. I have my own opinions.
I think Catherine Graham did an incredible service to Washington when she instituted Book World, and it was back in, I guess it was in the early 70s, Ab, you would know. early 70s, late 60s. When she took the Chicago Trib and she bought it up and she made this, she said no reputable newspaper would be without a strong, solid book review engine. And she supported it, through thick and thin. And there was a time when Book World went into the style section, and then because of public sort of grumbling, it went back into its own standalone issue. And I think that she did something in the course of making sure that Book World stayed alive and that it was as good as it was, and that it was given as much support. Even though it didn't have any ads in it, it was impossible to get New York publishers to put ads in a Washington newspaper or any other non-New York newspaper or publication. And even without the ads, without the revenues, Book World was supported, and it created a kind of, I think, a literary community. There was no doubt in my mind as an editor of that section for 10 years and deputy editor before that, that there was a very strong sort of dialogue with the reading public. You would get calls, you would get letters, we set up the Washington Post Book Club, people came, different audiences for every kind of, we'd put on a poetry thing, it would be, a poetry audience. If we put on something about the Civil War, it would be a Civil War audience. The readers were there, and there was a very strong communication. And that's something that even though today it goes on in the sense that there are maybe 2/3 of the amount of book reviews are still being run in the Washington Post, but I don't think there is that sense of dialogue of the community that was there when that standalone issue existed. And
part of that, though, was that first at that point it was the only game in town. Like
right.
There were no other places in there was no internet.
Right. And so I mourn that sort of public connection that it once had.
And it's also worth pointing out that just on a purely practical level, the book world for years and years and years and years and years gave freelance gigs to Washington critics and let them build clips and experience writing for a completely first-class newspaper and book review that they maybe otherwise would not have the chance to get. If you're not in New York, if you weren't in New York once upon a time, it was basically impossible to get a book review gig anywhere, but the Washington Post gave a lot of local writers the chance to write about a lot of amazing books, which I think is totally worthwhile.
And the jury's out as to what Jeff Bezos is going to do with it. On the one hand, great interest in books, on the other end, and money and digital expertise. On the other hand, it's a little cozy with the selling part. We'll see what happens.
Yes.
I've enjoyed reading noir fiction, city noir fiction from around the world, Kingston, Jamaica, wherever, for texture and grit. I'm wondering, is there such a thing as, would there be a Washington noir, and who would be in it, and what would it be like?
Jennifer was in it.
There is one.
Let's let Jennifer address this question.
I don't know if you know the publisher Akashic Books. They're based in Brooklyn, I think.
Yeah.
But they've done a city series, a noir series. So there's a volume, DC Noir, edited by George Pelecanos. I have a story in it, a number of familiar, Laura Lippman, who's also in Baltimore Noir. James Grady, who wrote 6 Days of the Condor, which inspired the movie 3 Days of the Condor. And a bunch of other people, some of whom you'd know, some whom you might not recognize. But that's a great series if you want to explore noir fiction set in different urban settings around the country.
So rarely do we get questions we can just so specifically answer with a specific recommendation.
I think they've run out of noirs, by the way. I think Antarctica noir is the only
They've
thing.
actually gone international now. There's Dublin noir.
Yeah, I know. The Manila noir. There's
Yes, right here in the middle.
I noticed you didn't mention anywhere about the significant number of writers groups that are here in the district. There's a group called meetup.com. There are lots of them. I was for 2 years at the Silver Spring Writers Group that's been around for almost 10 years. But they do social things. Some of them do salons. I'm wondering if you're aware of that kind of activity?
I had always sort of assumed there must be writers groups somewhere in Washington, but I'm glad to hear that there are a lot and that they're meeting up through
There's a lot
Meetup.
of really great book clubs in DC who are
Yeah.
really enthusiastic and will like, if you're a writer, you should find a book club.
In
for
addition,
writers groups.
In addition to the writers groups, yeah.
That's great. It's great if there's that kind of culture there. Yeah.
And I do think Washington has such a tradition, as you mentioned from the very beginning with Walt Whitman, of people who are making their living in other ways, but who are writers, who are writing all the time, who are writing their lives or who are writing stories. And writers groups have always traditionally been a really amazing home for people who want to hone what they do and want to get better, but who are not necessarily trying to write like the great Brooklyn novel. We're really beating up on Brooklyn here, but who are not necessarily who are not aiming for Scribner to publish their memoir, but who just want to tell a story and want to tell it as well as they can. And writers groups have always traditionally been a great place for those people to get what they want to get out of writing. Do we have other questions? Yes, right here in the front. Please wait for your microphone.
This isn't a question, it's just to applaud DC. There is not a single night when there are not 3 separate, maybe, or 4 separate events celebrating writing, whether it's Politics and Prose, the Library of Congress, the Folger, all the different writing groups. The basement of the Politics and Prose, that funky place, just breeds readers and writers, and all the different book groups. I think we're just about as rich a place as there could be for readers as well as for writers. And you just can't get, there's not time enough to absorb it all.
Let's
so
applaud
thank
DC.
everybody, yes, for making it.
That's a fine note to bring us to a conclusion on. Thank you for attending this, the final joyous gasp of non-essential federal government. We've been very honored to have you here. Thank you very much. And thank you to our amazing panelists. Big ups.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.